It was supposed to be one of those rare, perfect nights where nothing goes wrong, the kind of garage party that starts casually and slowly turns into something memorable, because it wasn't loud chaos or reckless behavior, it was a handful of friends, music at a reasonable level, the garage door half open for airflow, and laughter echoing softly down the driveway. But what none of us realized was that one phone call would turn that relaxed night into a moment that would permanently expose how fragile HOA authority becomes when it collides with reality, because less than 20 minutes after the music started, an unmistakable figure appeared at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, posture rigid, eyes locked onto the garage like she was witnessing a crime scene instead of a few neighbors enjoying themselves, and before anyone even acknowledged her presence, she was already dialing her phone, pacing, and loudly announcing that she was calling the police for a disturbance, and the confidence in her voice wasn't based on facts, it was based on assumption, the assumption that her title within the HOA gave her control over everyone else's choices, and while we continued talking, assuming this would end with a warning or nothing at all, she stood there narrating the situation loudly into her phone, exaggerating noise levels, implying disorder, and repeatedly stressing that she was on the board. As if that phrase alone demanded immediate enforcement, and the irony was that the party itself was tame, no block streets, no yelling, no violations, just a group of people talking, grilling, and enjoying a Friday night, and as she ended the call, she turned toward the garage with a look of smug satisfaction, confidently declaring that the cops were on their way and that everyone should start clearing out, because she believed that fear would do what authority couldn't. And that belief was about to backfire spectacularly, because what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that several of the people standing in that garage weren't just friends, they were off-duty law enforcement officers from multiple departments, gathered casually, relaxed, and completely within their rights, and as the realization slowly dawned on them that the police were being summoned for a non-existent issue, the mood didn't turn hostile, it turned amused. Because nothing exposes abuse of authority faster than forcing real authority to show up unnecessarily, and while she stood there rehearsing complaints in her head, checking her phone repeatedly, and glancing toward the street for flashing lights, the officers exchanged looks, subtle smiles, and quiet nods, because they understood exactly how this was going to end, and when the first patrol car finally appeared at the end of the street, lights not even activated yet, her posture straightened instantly, chin lifted, confidence peaking, because in her mind, backup had arrived, and as the car pulled closer, followed by a second and then a third, confusion briefly crossed her face before being replaced by triumph, because she assumed this meant the situation was serious, and she stepped forward eagerly to greet them, ready to assert control, completely unaware that in just a few minutes she would be standing face to face with nearly everyone she had just tried to weaponize, and that the power dynamic she believed protected her was about to collapse in front of her neighbors, her board, and the entire precinct she had called for help. The moment the first officer stepped out of the patrol car, the entire energy of the driveway shifted, because authority had arrived, just not in the way she expected, and while she rushed forward, already mid-sentence about noise violations and unauthorized gatherings, the officer barely made it 3 steps before freezing, eyes narrowing slightly, head tilting, as recognition kicked in, and then it happened again with the second officer, and again with the third, because each of them recognized faces standing casually inside the garage, leaning against tool cabinets, holding paper plates, and chatting like it was any other evening, and suddenly the scene stopped being about a complaint and started becoming something deeply uncomfortable for the person who made it, because one by one the officers walking up the driveway began greeting the guests instead of questioning them, nodding, smiling, and casually asking how their shifts had been, how their families were doing, and whether anyone wanted another burger before the grill cooled off, and that's when confusion punched through her confidence like a crack in glass, because the script she had written in her head wasn't being followed at all, and instead of officers demanding names or shutting things down, they were exchanging inside jokes, comparing schedules, and recognizing people she had just labeled as disruptive, and her voice, once sharp and commanding, suddenly faltered. As she tried to redirect attention back to herself, repeatedly interrupting to insist that she was the one who called and that there was an HOA issue that needed enforcement, but the officers barely acknowledged her, not out of disrespect, but out of clarity, because nothing in front of them resembled a violation, and as one of the off-duty officers finally stepped forward, badge still clipped to his belt out of habit, and calmly explained that the gathering was private, compliant, and well within local ordinances, the air went silent, because authority had just spoken without raising its voice, and for the first time that night, she wasn't the loudest person in the driveway, and that silence did something devastating to her posture, because it forced her to stand there, arms still crossed, realizing she no longer controlled the narrative, and when one of the responding officers finally turned to her and asked, very calmly, what specific law she believed was being broken, she stumbled, repeating vague phrases about HOA rules and quiet hours, only to be gently reminded that HOA regulations are not criminal statutes and do not warrant police intervention, and that reminder hit harder than any lecture ever could, because it stripped away the illusion that the police were an extension of HOA power, and as more officers arrived, some called in simply because they heard familiar names over the radio, the driveway began to resemble a reunion more than a response, with laughter replacing tension and casual conversations breaking out between uniforms and civilians alike, and every additional patrol car that pulled up chipped away another layer of her authority, because instead of backing her up, the situation was making her look increasingly isolated, and neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the unexpected activity, watching quietly as the woman who so often lectured them about compliance now stood awkwardly off to the side, ignored by the very system she believed she commanded. And when a supervising officer finally arrived and assessed the scene in under 30 seconds, his conclusion was immediate and final, because there was no disturbance, no threat, and no reason for police presence, and as he addressed everyone with a brief apology for the inconvenience, the message was clear without being cruel. And when he turned back to her and firmly explained that repeated misuse of emergency services could result in consequences, her face drained of color, because the power play she initiated had not only failed, it had reversed, and in that moment, surrounded by flashing lights that no longer belonged to her story, she realized she wasn't the authority in the driveway anymore, she was the cautionary example. The real humiliation didn't hit her when the officers dismissed the complaint, it hit her when they stayed, because instead of immediately clearing out, the responding officers lingered for a few minutes longer than necessary, not out of spite but familiarity, and that extra time stretched the moment in a way she couldn't escape, because neighbors had now fully gathered, standing on porches, leaning over railings, phones quietly recording, and suddenly the person who had spent years weaponizing rules was the one being quietly observed, and as laughter drifted from the garage and one of the officers jokingly asked if anyone had extra napkins, the illusion shattered completely, because this wasn't chaos, this wasn't disorder, this was community, and she was standing outside of it, and when she tried one last time to assert herself by loudly announcing that the HOA would be following up, her voice cracked slightly, not from emotion but from the realization that nobody reacted, nobody flinched, nobody cared, because threats only work when people believe you have leverage, and in that moment, she didn't, and as the officers finally began returning to their vehicles, a supervisor paused just long enough to deliver a final, quiet warning about false reports, explaining that the system exists for emergencies, not personal disputes, and that if there were future calls like this without cause, they would be documented, and that word, documented, landed like a weight because documentation is what she lived by, and now it was turned toward her, and as the patrol cars pulled away one by one, leaving the driveway lit only by the garage lights again, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the shift remained, because power once lost doesn't reset overnight, and as she walked back toward her house alone, shoulders tight, eyes locked forward, the neighborhood didn't see a villain retreating, they saw something more unsettling. Someone who had finally been exposed, and inside my garage the conversation resumed, but it was different now, quieter, reflective, because everyone there understood what had just happened wasn't about a party, it was about boundaries, and as someone joked that this might be the quietest HOA complaint on record, we all laughed, but underneath it was relief, because tonight proved something important, that intimidation only works when people are isolated, and the moment community stands together, it collapses, and later, long after the last guest left and the garage door finally closed, I checked my phone and saw messages from neighbors thanking me, not for the party, but for standing firm, and that's when I realized this night would ripple forward, because tomorrow the HOA would still exist, but its shadow would be smaller, and her authority would be questioned in ways it never had been before, and all of it started because she tried to turn police into a weapon, and instead, the truth showed up in uniform and refused to play along. What she didn't realize that night, standing alone after the patrol cars left, was that the real consequences hadn't even started yet, because the true fallout of abusing authority doesn't arrive with sirens, it arrives quietly, in emails, in meetings, and in the way people stop nodding when you speak, and the very next morning proved that, because before sunrise, my phone was already buzzing with screenshots from the neighborhood group chat, messages she didn't control, conversations she couldn't delete, and for the first time, residents were openly comparing stories about warnings, fines, threats, and intimidation they had tolerated for years, and what made this different was timing, because last night gave everyone a shared reference point, a moment they all saw with their own eyes, where power failed publicly, and once that happens it never fully recovers, and by mid-morning, the HOA inbox was flooded, not with complaints, but with questions, because people started asking for bylaws, for enforcement authority, for explanations, and nothing terrifies a control-based system more than scrutiny, and as someone who had lived under her constant pressure, I knew exactly what that meant, because she thrived in ambiguity, where rules were vague enough to bend but sharp enough to threaten, and now those rules were being pulled into the light, clause by clause. And when the emergency HOA meeting was announced for that same week, it wasn't framed as damage control, but everyone knew that's exactly what it was, because meetings don't happen that fast unless someone is scared, and walking into that room days later felt different than any HOA meeting before, because the usual tension was replaced by something steadier, confidence, and as she sat at the front table with her clipboard and forced smile, the room didn't quiet down the way it used to. Because respect given out of fear disappears the moment fear stops working, and when residents began calmly recounting their own experiences, one after another, it created a pattern she couldn't interrupt, because this wasn't anger, it was testimony, and the more people spoke, the clearer it became that last night wasn't an isolated incident, it was the breaking point. And when someone finally brought up the police call directly, explaining how misuse of emergency services could put the entire HOA under scrutiny, her attempt to deflect fell flat, because the board members themselves looked uneasy. Realizing liability doesn't care about ego, and in that moment, I understood something important, that bullies don't fear confrontation, they fear records, because records don't forget, and as the meeting dragged on longer than scheduled, questions kept coming, not emotional ones, but procedural ones, the kind that require real answers, and when she couldn't provide them, the silence in the room did the work for her. Because silence exposes gaps louder than shouting ever could, and by the time the meeting adjourned, nothing had been officially decided, but everything had changed, because authority isn't lost through votes alone, it's lost when people stop believing, and walking out that night, I felt something shift permanently, because the HOA still existed on paper, but the myth around it was gone, and all because she picked the wrong night, the wrong house, and the wrong people to intimidate. The next escalation didn't come as confrontation, it came as retaliation disguised as procedure, because a week later, violation notices started appearing like clockwork, clipped neatly to doors, sent by certified mail, and buried in inboxes, and almost every single one traced back to households that had either attended the party, spoken at the meeting, or openly questioned her authority. And that pattern was impossible to ignore, because enforcement wasn't about compliance anymore, it was about punishment, and she thought doing it quietly would make it safer, but instead it made it obvious, because retaliation leaves fingerprints, and when neighbors began comparing notices, lining them up side by side, identical language, identical deadlines, identical threats, the illusion of neutrality collapsed again, and that's when something unexpected happened, because instead of panicking, people organized. Not emotionally, but strategically, and suddenly attorneys were being consulted. Public records requests were being filed, and the phrase selective enforcement started circulating, and that phrase is dangerous, because it's measurable, provable, and actionable, and the more she tightened enforcement, the more documentation piled up, because control addicts always overplay their hand, and when a formal complaint was finally submitted to the city, it wasn't fueled by revenge. It was fueled by evidence, dates, copies, recordings, timelines, and that's when the tone shifted entirely, because now it wasn't neighbors versus HOA, it was an institution versus oversight, and oversight doesn't care who feels offended, it cares who followed the rules, and as inspectors began requesting records, budgets, and enforcement logs, her posture changed again, because systems that rely on intimidation crumble under audits, and every unanswered email, every missing document, every inconsistent fine added pressure, and while she tried to maintain control publicly, behind the scenes, the board began distancing themselves, because no one wants to go down with the loudest person in the room, and as weeks passed, residents noticed something subtle but telling, the warnings stopped, the fines paused, and the emails grew shorter, more cautious, because fear had changed sides, and when the city finally scheduled a formal review, the outcome wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. But administrative consequences last longer, because they don't fade with memory, and as the HOA was instructed to revise procedures, retrain leadership, and suspend certain enforcement powers pending compliance, the message was clear without being personal, and that's when it fully sank in for her, because she didn't lose power to rebellion, she lost it to structure, and that's the kind of loss that doesn't come back. To be why the time her resignation email quietly landed in everyone's inbox, there was no shock left, only confirmation, because leadership built on fear always exits through silence. And the message itself was short, professional, and vague, citing personal reasons and a desire to move on, but nobody needed translation, because the story had already been written publicly, and what followed wasn't celebration, it was relief, because the neighborhood didn't want revenge, it wanted peace, and that's exactly what arrived, slowly, steadily, as new board members were elected, procedures rewritten, and communication shifted from threats to transparency, and standing in my garage months later, looking at the same space where the night started, I realized how close this all came to going differently, because intimidation works best when people stay isolated, quiet and unsure, and the only reason it failed was because she overreached in public, involving authorities she didn't control, and that mistake echoed outward until it unraveled everything she built, and the lesson stuck with everyone. Not just about HOAs, but about power itself, because the loudest authority often has the weakest foundation, and true control doesn't need to announce itself at 4 a.m. with a phone call, it simply exists, and when it doesn't, no amount of shouting can fake it. The truth is, most people think power disappears loudly with shouting, lawsuits, or dramatic exits, but what I learned after everything settled is that real power dies quietly, in routine moments where intimidation no longer works, and I saw that clearly the first time a new HOA notice arrived months later, written in neutral language, outlining options instead of threats. Because that single page proved something had fundamentally changed, not just structurally, but culturally, and neighbors felt it too, Because people started using shared spaces again without constantly checking over their shoulders, conversations returned to normal topics instead of whispered complaints, and the tension that once sat heavy over the block slowly dissolved. And what made this transformation meaningful wasn't that one person lost authority, it was that the system finally stopped rewarding abuse, because for years, enforcement had depended on people not pushing back, not asking questions, and not documenting interactions, and the moment that pattern broke, everything downstream corrected itself. And standing there one evening watching kids ride bikes past garages that used to feel off limits, I realized how subtle control can be, because it doesn't always look like shouting or fines, sometimes it looks like silence, the kind that convinces people not to challenge what feels wrong. And that silence ended the night the police showed up and refused to play a role they were never meant to fill, and what followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity, because clarity is dangerous to anyone who survives on ambiguity, and over time, residents became more confident, not aggressive, not defiant, just informed, and that shift mattered, because informed people don't need to fight authority, they simply require it to justify itself, and when it can't, it collapses under its own weight. And I often think back to that initial moment, the sound of sirens cutting through what was supposed to be a quiet intimidation tactic, and how ironic it is that calling for enforcement was the very thing that exposed the lack of it, because once outside oversight gets involved, narratives lose flexibility, and what began as an attempt to shut down a garage party ended up dismantling a culture of fear, not through rebellion, but through visibility, and that's the part people underestimate, because bullies don't fear resistance. They fear witnesses, and that night created many, and even now, long after the drama faded, the lesson lingers, that systems only stay broken when people believe they're alone inside them. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly things changed after the resignation, it was how many neighbors later admitted they had assumed nothing could ever change, because that belief had been reinforced slowly over years of minor punishments, warnings, and selective enforcement that taught people resistance was pointless. And hearing those stories afterward made it clear that the most damaging part of authority abuse isn't the punishment itself, it's the hopelessness it creates, and that hopelessness vanished once people saw consequences applied in the opposite direction, because accountability isn't dramatic, it's stabilizing. And when the new board started holding open meetings, publishing minutes, and inviting feedback instead of silencing it, attendance increased, not out of anger but trust. And the irony was unmistakable, because participation rose the moment fear disappeared, and I noticed it in myself too, because where I once avoided involvement to stay off a list, I now felt comfortable engaging openly, and that shift didn't require bravery, it required safety, and safety only arrived when power stopped being personal, and instead became procedural, because procedures don't hold grudges, they don't retaliate, they simply function. And that's what effective governance looks like when stripped of ego, and sometimes late at night, when things were quiet. Again, I'd think about how close this came to ending differently, because if the police had blindly enforced HOA demands that night, the message would have been devastating, confirming every fear residents had internalized, but instead neutrality prevailed, and that neutrality gave people permission to question everything that followed, and the lesson stuck with me beyond HOAs, beyond neighborhoods. Because it applies everywhere authority exists, that unchecked power relies on silence, and once silence breaks, even politely, power has to either justify itself or step aside, and in our case it stepped aside, not because it was forced out violently, but because it couldn't survive in the open anymore, and that outcome didn't create chaos, it created balance, which is something control-based leadership never truly understands. And standing there months later, watching the same garage host another gathering without tension, I knew the story wasn't about revenge, it was about reset. Looking back now, the most powerful moment of the entire ordeal wasn't the flashing lights, the public embarrassment, or even the resignation, it was the quiet realization shared by an entire neighborhood that authority is only legitimate when it respects boundaries, because once that understanding takes root, intimidation loses its leverage forever. And what began as a woman trying to control a garage party ended as a community reclaiming its confidence, and that transformation didn't require heroics, it required visibility, documentation, and calm refusal to be bullied, and that's why this story still matters, because situations like this aren't rare, they're just rarely exposed, and the difference between endless abuse and sudden change is often one moment where power reaches too far and gets caught in the open, and when that happens everything shifts, because systems built on fear cannot survive daylight. And as I close my garage door now, hearing laughter fade into a peaceful night instead of tension, I understand something I didn't before, that standing your ground doesn't always mean confrontation, sometimes it simply means letting truth show up, because truth doesn't need volume, it just needs space, and once it has that, control collapses on its own.